It's Friday again. World Economic News. United States of America, calculated risk, new home sales decline in October, and the opening chart, new home sales going back to 1963. New home sales at the moment, 280 something thousand. Look across the line, all the way back to 1963, never been this low before. But obviously there were too many houses being built, so it's necessary to stop building those houses, and that looks like what they've done. Good plan. Next is real personal consumption, again calculated risk, United States of America, and personal consumption is coming back. Next chart, calculated risk, United States of America, truck tonnage, ATA truck tonnage. You can see the recession there, and it's back up to a level of 06, 07. Basically what we have is the United States of America has come from down below and is starting to level out at a really unacceptably low level of growth. There is growth, but it's not nearly enough for the economic system that we have, and it's certainly not enough for the unemployed that are hanging around doing nothing. Over in Europe, RFI English gives us Portuguese general strike seeks to bring the country to a standstill. Public and private sector workers in Portugal are staging what the unions are describing as the country's biggest ever strike in protest against unpopular government austerity measures. Bloomberg, Greek unions prepare for strike against new austerity measures. Soon, obviously, we've seen a few demonstrations. Well, of course, when you get austerity, you're going to demonstrate against it. But these smaller demonstrations don't seem to be really amounting to enough. Government's got a handle on it. But Caixin Online, destination inflation. This is Andy Z, who writes very well about China. And it's a longish article, but well worth reading. China's nettlesome inflation problem today is a flashback to what it faced in 1994. What will it take to tame it this time? Inflation has become a threat to social stability. The government is responding with a combination of monetary tightening and price controls. While these measures may calm inflation fears among the masses for the time being, the fear may come back with a vengeance if the measures fail to achieve the stated purpose. Civil unrest never far away in China. Bloomberg Businessweek, Putin, so we're obviously in Russia, more trade with China in local currencies. Prime Minister Vladimir Putin says Russia and China have agreed to increase the use of national currencies in bilateral trade. Don't worry, the dollar isn't going to get swept aside by things like this. This is, in the larger scale of things, irrelevant, but interesting. Bloomberg also gives us the ruble debt sales rocked by Ireland, weaker exchange rate and Russia credit. Russia may cancel sales of domestic bonds for the second time this month and delay its first ever offering of ruble-denominated debt abroad, as concerns over the weakening currency and Ireland's bailout curtail demand. It seems to me that they're rather throwing Ireland in there for no particular reason, but what do I know? Reuters gives us Germany sells 4.8 billion euros of bunds. That's what they call them there. Germany sold 4.8 billion euros of new 10-year bonds. Nice crackly 10-year German bonds on Wednesday with low yields, failing to draw enough bids to cover the amount on offer despite a market pickup in risk appetite. The sale came as peripheral Eurozone issuers came under intensifying pressure, with contagion fears pushing Spanish and Portuguese yield spreads over bonds to new Euro lifetime highs. The German Bund sale, which carried a coupon of 2.5%, 2.5 10-year, nearly nothing, and priced with an average yield of 2.59%, attractive bids of 5.6 billion euros against a target amount of 6 billion. So they couldn't even get the whole thing away, even in Germany. Clear on Money it's an interesting article about bank regulation and all that sort of stuff. Well, the looking into this mortgage fraud, and he's talking about Felix Salmon writing at Reuters article, which I read, which was typical Felix Salmon, which was just kind of asking for trouble. Well, he got it from Jim Fickett here, who says bank regulators don't have the expertise to examine loan documentation problems, and the federal government doesn't have the backbone to risk bringing systemic problems out into the open. If we get a real resolution to the mortgage documentation problems, it will come from investor pressure. In other words, the people that had the dodgy stuff pushed upon them will sue back in the courts to get those sales pushed back onto the people that sold them to them in a private way. I would tend to agree with Jim that government is just not qualified or capable of sorting out a major problem such as this. FT Alphaville, beware the reflexivity of Irish bonds. Now, reflexivity obviously referring to George Soros, but we get respected economist Paul de Grauw, and I've read some of his stuff before, and I like the cut of Paul de Grauw's jib, so maybe he is a real thing called a respected economist. Who knows? Anyway, he has a big warning for the Eurozone on the back of the Irish and Greek sovereign crises. It's an interesting article, and I'm not going to be able to pull out the whole essence of it, and it'd be worth following it back to read Paul's entire paper on this. This interpretation of the source of the debt crisis in the Eurozone has become popular mainly because it fits the Greek crisis well. It cannot, however, explain the debt crisis involving the other Eurozone countries, where the root cause of the debt problems is to be found in the unsustainable debt accumulation of the private sectors. What he's saying is Greek government overspent, but in the other countries, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, etc., it's the United Kingdom, it's the private sector that has overspent. From 1999 until 2008, when the financial crisis erupted, private households in the Eurozone increased their debt levels from about 50% of GDP up to 70% of GDP. And that's across the Eurozone, with Germany being nothing on that. So there's been a lot of increase in the peripheral countries. The explosion of bank debt in the Eurozone was even more spectacular and reached more than 250% of GDP in 2008. Surprisingly, the only sector that did not experience an increase in its debt level during that period was the government sector, which saw its debt decline from 72 to 68% of GDP. Ireland and Spain, two of the countries with the severest government debt problems today, experienced the strongest declines in their government debt ratios prior to the crisis. These are also the countries where the private debt accumulation was the strongest. What he's pointing out is trying to apply the same cure to Irish and Spanish Portuguese problem as to the Greek problem is obviously wrong, because they're at base are different problems. And there's a lot of, then he goes on to explain how Soros attacked the exchange rate mechanism and made so much money, and goes on to point out how, I'll call it the Merkel plan of giving bondholders haircuts, can be gamed by the market, or will be gamed by the market in a similar sort of fashion, which gives us, thus one should expect that the introduction of the sovereign debt default mechanism, that I'm calling the Merkel plan, sovereign debt default mechanism, will make debt crises in the Eurozone more frequent and more lethal. Whether the Eurozone can survive such a structural increase in the frequency and intensity of debt crises remains to be seen. I suspect that, if applied, the sovereign debt default mechanism will destabilize the Eurozone and ensure its demise. That finishes that, and FT Alphaville finishes off with, which partly explains the now seemingly unstoppable contagion into Spanish bonds. And I see a wonderful dynamic working in quite a few of these cases of the private market and the government, with the government trying to get control over aspects of the private market and the private market pushing back, with, depending how you look at it, the government generally losing because it just hasn't got what it takes to take on the private sector that dedicates its life to doing its job and lives and dies by the job that it succeeds or doesn't succeed in doing, where governments don't. Have a good weekend. Bye.